garrison was on a war footing in early December, and General Maltby ordered a state of high alert the day before the Japanese carried out their attack on Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese assault on the Crown Colony of Hong Kong came around 8 hours after Pearl Harbor, they came in overwhelming force. The attackers consisted of the 23rd Field Army of the Imperial Japanese Army, supported by the 45th Air Regiment. In total, the Japanese commander of the assault, General Takaishi Sakai, was supported by 52,000 men, and many of those soldiers had had extensive combat experience fighting the Chinese. The Punjab and Rajput regiments that held outposts were quickly driven into the gin drinkers' line. The Japanese took a position called Golden Hill on the western side of the line, but were driven back by a counterattack. Some units of the Winnipeg Grenadiers were sent to reinforce the line. There were seesaw attacks over the next 2 days before the Japanese consolidated their positions and controlled the western part of the line. The British had to pull back through Kowloon and withdraw onto Hong Kong Island, with the Grenadiers as a rearguard. A unit of Rajputs held a position called Devil's Peak until 13 December. Then they also withdrew. The British had a respite for several days, rejecting demands to surrender. The garrison was reorganized into 2 brigades. The Winnipeg Grenadiers, Punjabis, and Royal Scots battalions formed the West Brigade under the command of Canadian Brigadier John Lawson. The East Brigade consisted of the Royal Rifles and the Rajput Regiment. Once the Japanese had brought up their artillery, they commenced a bombardment of the northern sectors of Hong Kong Island, as well as continuing their air attacks. This bombardment lasted for several days and severely disrupted communications and defences. When the Japanese landing took place during the night of 18 December, 6 battalions and 3 regiments, they met opposition from the Rajputs, who were virtually wiped out. By daylight, the attackers were in possession of hills overlooking the harbour. They then moved on with a clear aim of splitting the island in 2. The main fighting took place along the north-south road at a place called the Wong Nei Chong Gap. The Japanese 228 Regiment held the gap, but were repulsed by the Canadians. It was in this area that Brigadier Lawson was killed leading his troops. Witnesses said that he attacked the enemy with a pistol in each hand. Reinforcements from the rest of the garrison were quickly moved to the area, including some companies of the Grenadiers, but their attacks could not be coordinated. The Japanese pressed hard, and the British stubbornly resisted. On 19 December, Sergeant Major John Osborne of the Winnipeg Grenadiers became an exemplar of their bravery. A company of the Grenadiers had become divided during the Japanese push into the hills. The Japanese captured Mount Butler, a key point of the defence line. Sergeant Major Osborne's men recaptured the hill with a bayonet charge and then held it for 3 hours. Outnumbered and outflanked, they had to pull back, while Sergeant Major Osborne held off the enemy single-handedly. During that afternoon, the small group of grenadiers was entirely surrounded and low on ammunition, but they still held off the Japanese with their grenades for nearly 8 hours. When a Japanese grenade fell near his men, the Sergeant Major threw himself onto it to protect them. Sergeant Major Osborne was awarded the Victoria Cross for his sacrifice, and his bravery is commemorated by this statue in a park in Hong Kong. A Canadian mascot, a Newfoundland dog named Gander, was awarded the Dickon Medal, called the Animal's Victoria Cross, for a similar action when he picked up a Japanese grenade that fell near wounded soldiers and ran with it towards the Japanese. Despite many acts of bravery, the Japanese were able to retake the Wong Nei Chong Gap and push on into the centre and then the eastern part of Hong Kong Island. The garrison was split in two on 20 December. Several units of the Grenadiers were separated from the rest of the regiment, but dug in wherever they were and resisted attacks for some days with limited ammunition and virtually no food. The Royal Rifles succeeded in retaking some positions south of the Tai Tam Tuk Reservoir. On 22 December, the Japanese captured Sugarloaf Hill, but were driven off by C Company of the Rifles. General Maltby hoped to hold the western area and the Stanley Peninsula until he could reorganize the surviving soldiers and make one more counterattack. On the morning of Christmas Day, D Company of the Royal Rifles made such a counterattack and recaptured territory occupied by the Japanese. However, Japanese pressure continued, and when they made one more heavy attack on the afternoon of Christmas Day, it became evident that further resistance would mean useless loss of lives, and General Maltby agreed to surrender. The Governor of Hong Kong, Sir Mark Aitchison Young, signed the surrender documents at the Peninsula Hotel that evening. Of the 14,000 soldiers of the garrison, just 6,500 survived unwounded. The Canadians had lost 800 casualties. 200 more were to die under the deprivations of Japanese prison camps. The gallant stand of the garrison did not go unheralded. The courage of all the troops was recorded, and there was pride mixed with sorrow back home. Elsewhere in Asia, the fortress island of Singapore, supposedly impregnable, fell on 14 February, 7 weeks after Hong Kong. That garrison had held for just 6 days, though they far outnumbered their attackers. In comparison, the garrison of Hong Kong, outnumbered 4-1, had held out for 17 days. Their stand inspired others to try to emulate their bravery. Canadian soldiers would be involved in many other battles in North Africa and Europe, particularly in the bold but ill-starred raid on Dieppe. Of 4,500 troops on that operation, most of them Canadian, nearly half were killed or captured. Then came the invasion of Europe, D-Day. The invaders consisted of the American First Army and the Second Army, comprising British and Canadian troops. When the Japanese surrendered in August 1945, Canadians landed in Hong Kong to succour their compatriots. Then, in an irony of war, the freed POWs were transported back to Canada in the ship that had brought them to Hong Kong in 1941, namely the Prince Robert.